I'd like to give a warm welcome to my good friend and colleague, Elon Berman. Elon Berman is the Senior Vice President for the American Foreign Policy Council. He is a renowned expert on Iran, on Russia, on great power competition, and Islamist terrorist networks worldwide. He's the author of several books, including several books on Iran itself, on Iran's strategy and Iran's global ambitions. And he's a tireless travel companion for myself. We've been able to take along to Latin America several years in running, and he's done several briefings in Latin America in countries like Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Brazil. So he's not a stranger to the region, but he's definitely a welcome guest to Seguridad Sin Filtros. Elon, great to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Oh, thanks, Joseph. It's wonderful to be here.
Okay, so to begin, I'd like to give a little plug to shameless self-promotion to our joint op-ed. Elon and I, who worked together on this issue of Iran and Latin America for several years, we started talking, I think it was in the beginning of June, and we knew about the warships, we knew about the potential voyage, transatlantic voyage to Venezuela, or to the Caribbean at least, and we decided to start prepping with that to put this into a larger context so that most of the public and also the policy community can understand. So, Alon, to begin the conversation, I'd like for you just to kind of begin where you began the op-ed, in a sense of paint this picture of where does this kind of transatlantic voyage by the Iranian Navy fit within their larger geopolitical strategy? Because obviously Iran's not known to have a conventional military that's at all very capable, unlike most Western nations, but yet they may have a different view of themselves. So maybe you could help us understand what's the big picture here.
Right. So no, and I think that's exactly the right place to start, because what we're really talking about are two separate things. One is Iran's expanding military capabilities, and those capabilities are expanding, and they have expanded over the last several years. And the second is Latin America, and sort of how Latin America nests and fits into Iran's larger global strategy. So on the first part in particular, it's worth noting, I think, that what we've seen over the last several years has been a fairly significant expansion of Iran's military ambitions and strategic ambitions. The Iranian regime is an exceptionalist regime. It believes that it is naturally the regional hegemon of the Middle East, that in their own words, that it's the center of the universe around which regional politics have to revolve. But for years and years, the Iranian regime hasn't been able to achieve that objective. They've been constrained by ruinous economic policies in the early going. They've been constrained by the 8-year war with neighboring Iraq, and then more recently by Western sanctions. But increasingly, what you've seen, and in particular, this kicked off as a result of the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1 powers, was that there were massive infusions of cash into the Iranian economy, which the regime translated into a very robust military modernization capability, and a modernization capability that's been ongoing, despite the fact that over the last 2 years, we've seen a fairly significant pressure campaign on the part of the Trump administration against Iran. And so what you see is, these long-standing ambitions, and increasingly these military investments that make Iran capable of this sort of global reach. And the Iranians have been talking about a global reach, in particular a naval global reach, for a long time. So I see this warship voyage, this expeditionary foray in the naval domain, as very significant, because it suggests to me that the Iranians are becoming increasingly mature in terms of their military capabilities, and they're moving in the direction of being able to operationalize what they've wanted to do for a long time.
Yeah, I want to jump and kind of pin down on one of the points that you made, because one of the things that I've been addressing, one of the things I've been hearing here in Washington is, well, where does the nuclear deal fit into this, and where do the current nuclear negotiations also fit? Let me begin with the deal, because there's essentially kind of two schools of thought. One school thinks that this is actually happening because the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear deal. So therefore, Iran has become, once again, more provocative, more aggressive, looking to escalate things. The other school of thought is this is happening specifically because of the nuclear deal, because the nuclear deal provided that level of legitimacy and to some level, even financially, some solvency that Iran has been able to capitalize on to rebuild its military, its navy, and other things. So the first question would be, where do you sit within those two schools? Or perhaps you have another school, the Berman school of thought, maybe.
The perfect school.
And then the second point, just to couple it with two questions.
Yeah.
The second question would be, where do the current nuclear negotiations fit into this? Because obviously the timing is very coincidental that these ships, these warships from Iran, are sailing into the South Atlantic precisely at the time when the Biden administration is looking to sit down with the Iranian regime to talk once again about nuclear negotiations. So the two questions about the nuclear deal in the past and the nuclear negotiations now.
Right. So no, and the Berman school, such as it is I think somewhere in the middle between those two extremes, because I think both are true to a fairly significant extent. On the one hand, the 2015 negotiations, 2014-2015 negotiations that resulted in the JCPOA were very clearly a financial windfall for the Iranian regime. I think, the numbers tend to vary, but the back of the envelope calculations are that Iran received something along the lines of 1/4 of its annual governmental operating budget in sanctions relief, either in direct sanctions relief or in indirect sanctions relief. And with that much money, the Iranian regime was empowered to do things like military expansionism. Their defense budget grew very significantly in the immediate aftermath of the JCPOA. Recapitalization and reinvestment in support for proxy groups, things like that. But at the same time, and by the way, this problem set, this idea that the 2015 deal empowered all sorts of bad Iranian behavior was one of the core rationales of the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy. The idea was to squeeze Iran politically, squeeze Iran economically, and do so powerfully that the Iranians will be forced to curtail their malign behavior and come back to the negotiating table. But maximum pressure, and I think objectively, maximum pressure can be said was a tactical success. It was very clear that pressure from the United States, the expanding level of sanctions, had an effect on the Iranian economy, had an effect on political stability within Iran, but it didn't seem to have an effect on the amount of money and the amount of attention Iran was paying to military modernization. The Iranian regime has always preferred guns over butter. They've always preferred adventurous foreign policy, military adventurism over domestic prosperity. And this hasn't changed over the last couple of years. So over the last couple of years, as a result of maximum pressure, the Iranian regime has gotten poorer and less stable, but their focus on their strategic objectives has remained. And this sort of brings us to where we are currently, because the Biden administration is making a colossal gamble. The gamble is that if the United States returns to the 2015 nuclear deal, this will be the basis for what administration principals have called a, quote, longer and stronger agreement that'll happen after. We have to come back into compliance with the 2015 agreement, and then the Iranians will agree to a second agreement, which is sort of more comprehensive, covers more things, covers Iran's support for terrorism, Iran's regional meddling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a gamble because there's no real evidence to support the fact that the Iranians would be willing to do that. They certainly want to return to the 2015 nuclear deal because of the financial incentives that they received as a result and the sanctions relief that they're going to receive from the Biden administration if they come back into compliance. Where it goes from there, though, I think it's anybody's guess. But the Biden administration is hoping that the Iranians are willing to negotiate more things.
And where do you, Elon, where do you think that these warships specifically fit in those type of negotiations? Because I'm sure they're not something that the Biden administration is very happy about. At least they haven't been vocally happy about it through some of their public statements that they made here in Washington. Is this a pressuring mechanism to some degree, or is this completely unrelated to the nuclear negotiations that are happening with?
Undoubtedly, it's a pressure mechanism. Look, the Iranians have a problem. After roughly 2 years of maximum pressure on the part of the Trump administration, they have very little leverage, and the United States has a lot of leverage in these negotiations. Now, to be fair, the Biden administration isn't really acting like it has a lot of leverage. They're offering preemptive sanctions relief, they're offering preemptive concessions. But the reality on the ground is that the Iranian economy is very fragile, very brittle. As a result of Western sanctions, the US can pressure Iran to do a lot of things. And so what the Iranians have been doing, both in terms of their foreign policy and in terms of their military policy over the last 6 months, has been to try to increase their own leverage, increase their own bargaining power with regard to the United States. And it's a strategy that's working. Increasingly, as Iran behaves more and more badly in its immediate neighborhood, there is more and more pressure on the Biden administration to get the Iranians back into a box, to get them contained, to get them behaving better. And I see this naval expedition as part of that. Look, the ground truth of being a global power is being able to project power globally. The Iranians cannot project power globally at the moment. What they can do increasingly is build up the capabilities that will allow them to do that. That's why they're focusing on ballistic missiles. That's why they're focusing on a nuclear program. And increasingly, that's why they're focusing on a blue water navy that's capable of taking their military very far beyond Iran's shores. Because only in that fashion, only in that way, can they demonstrate to the world that they are a power to be reckoned with.
No, that makes sense. So, in full disclosure, Ilan and I, we co-edited a book together. We co-authored a book together back in 2014, and that's actually an interesting time frame because it was right during a period of transition, both for Venezuela and for Iran. Venezuela was coming off the death of Hugo Chavez and the ascension of Nicolas Maduro. And Iran was transitioning from the Ahmadinejad era to the Rouhani era that some thought would have a lot of distinction or difference, would turn out to be not too different in some respects. So we wrote this book called Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America. And what we predicted at the time in the book was that the relationship was enduring, that it didn't matter whether it was Ahmadinejad or Chavez or now Rouhani and Maduro, that the relationship, not just with Venezuela, but starting with Venezuela, but then potentially with other countries in the region, that Iran had a clear plan for how it wanted to penetrate Latin America. So Ilan, the last question actually that I have for you is, what do you think the relationship between Iran and Latin America is going to move towards? And now that we're seeing a clear escalation on behalf of Iran, we're seeing now overt military maneuvers, naval maneuvers, potentially into the Caribbean, into Venezuelan ports. And also, what should Latin Americans be on the lookout for? Because you're very well acquainted with how Iran operates in its near abroad, with supportive proxy groups. It's also its constant provocations and aggressions in the Gulf of Oman or in the Straits of Hormuz. Is this something that we now have to prepare for in the Western Hemisphere in Latin America? Are we far away from that? So what would be your message to Latin Americans who aren't used to Iranian warships in the waters?
Right, and on its surface, right, it looks like a very strange phenomenon, but it follows a pattern, and it's something that you've written about. It's something that I've written about. This pattern of penetration, where Iran goes from these irregular activities, starting with a decade and a half ago, starting with the assistance to Iran that was provided by anti-American regimes in Latin America for sanctions busting, right? For being able to keep their economy afloat despite widening Western sanctions, to where we are today, where increasingly you're moving from the irregular to a formal lash up between militaries, to a formal presence. You're moving from the tactical to the operational. And increasingly, the concern that I have, and a number of my colleagues have, is the degree to which Iran can have a sustainable strategic footprint in the Americas isn't just a political oddity, isn't just something that's sort of strange. It's a sort of a facet of modern politics, because Iran very clearly sees these sort of connections with countries like Venezuela, with countries like Cuba, and other regimes in the region as being operational in nature, as being able to to make real a military partnership that until now has been mostly political, mostly ideological. So that's what I really worry about. What I really worry about is these ties that Iran has to Latin America. As they become increasingly mature, they become more and more concrete, they become more and more operational in a way that empowers anti-American regimes in the region and provides very significant strategic support to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism.
No, absolutely. I think this is a clear warning sign. Back in the day when me and Alon used to actually spend more time in Latin America, we would say that this is maybe in the third inning, to use a baseball analogy. And what do we say, Alon? Maybe we're in the sixth inning now or seventh inning.
Yeah. We're getting towards the end of the game, in the sense that if you look back and just sort of an interesting historical analogy, in the last 15 years, there have already been 3 plots, either organized directly by Iran and its various military factions, or inspired by Iran, that have been directed against the continental United States. And my sense is, unfortunately, that's a sign of things to come, because as Iran becomes more and more established in the Western Hemisphere, the threat from Iran, not just ideological, not just political, but increasingly operational, becomes much more active.
Well, awesome, Alon. Masterful as always. It's always a great pleasure to have you. I'm very excited that the Latin American audience will get to listen to you, and hopefully, when the pandemic subsides, we're able to bring you back to Latin America and to some of these trips that we've taken into the region. Just as a final takeaway, Alon, where can the audience find you? Where can they follow you? I know you're the Senior Vice President, American Foreign Policy Council, an excellent think tank that talks about a lot of the big issues, including Russia, China, and Iran. But if you could give us just a plug of where the audience can find you or follow you and AFPC.
Sure. The American Foreign Policy Council is online at www.afpc.org. You can follow me on Twitter at Ilan Berman, ILANBERMAN. But mostly you can sort of see me, hopefully in the near future, traveling with Joseph.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll put all the links in the descriptions and the show notes. So thank you again, Alon. It's a pleasure to have you. And we'll definitely count on you next time. We have a pending conversation on Russia as well. So we'll definitely call you again to have that conversation, because as we know, Russia and Iran are also allies in this kind of global geopolitics. Thank you once again, and we'll go back to the regular programming.
Perfect. Thank you.